Hello everyone, let's continue our study on the inquiry. So in the previous video, we have introduced the inquiry and the pathogenesis on the coldness and heat, or the chills and fever. So those are the symptoms that the patient can feel, the cold feeling or the hot feeling. From this video, we're going to study the inquiry on perspiration. Perspiration. No matter what kinds of manifestations or symptoms we are going to study, the first thing that we're going to study is we need to study how we understand these symptoms from our theories. So, such as in the previous video, we talk about the chills and fever, or the coldness and heat. We need to know how we understand the fever or the chills feeling when the patient suffering. We need to understand what's the pathogenesis of these symptoms. Same as here, when we study about the sweating, the perspiration, we need to understand, we need to learn that's how we understand the perspiration. So from 黄帝内经, 素问 is the first volume of 黄帝内经. It describes that the perspiration is generated by yang qi steaming the yin fluid. So from this description, this clause, I like the translation as steaming, because in Chinese, this translation actually it is a direct translation. So in Mandarin, we also call it steam. The steaming, no matter in Mandarin or in English, it means that's similar to the picture on the right side. You cook something, and then the clouds of steam, the steaming, right? You can see the mist here, or the humid air here. That's the steam. So in this situation, in this condition, from 黄帝内经, it describes that the perspiration. What's the mechanism of perspiration? Why we can sweat? So the yin fluid refers to the body fluid. This is very similar when you cook the water, for instance, from the picture here, or you cook the food at home. You need the stove, right? You need the heat from the stove. You need a pot, and you need the water in the pot. That's how you can get the steam out of the pot. If you don't have enough fire here, or if you don't have enough heat, or if you have no water, you will never see the steam coming out from the pot, right? So exactly, the perspiration is very similar to the steam we see from on top of the pot. So that's the yang qi in the body. Steam, the body fluid. So the water in the pot is similar to our body fluid. The heat underneath, the heat here, is very similar to yang qi in the body. That's how we understand the perspiration. So if a patient suffers from disorder of perspiration, we need to think about what can cause the disorder. So what you need to think about is you need to think about when you cook your food. If you don't have steam here, what can be the cause of this problem? You forgot to turn on the heat, so there's no heat in your stove. Or if there's no water in the pot. Also, if there is heat there's heat here, although you turn on the heat, but you put a lot of ice water in the pot before the water becomes boiling. You don't see the steam. Especially if you put ice water, it takes much longer, right? So there's another situation. You turn on the heat. You have water here, but the heat is very low. So the water you can keep warm, but still don't see the steam there, right? So these are different situations in our daily life. You can see what can affect the steam. So exactly similar to this. Perspiration in our body. It might be we don't have enough heat. So if we forget to turn on the heat, which is yang deficiency, the heat is yang. So you don't have enough yang in the body, so you will have no sweat. Or if you don't have enough yin fluid in the body, you don't have water in the pot, so you don't have enough body fluid in the body, you also don't sweat. Or if you have the yang, the fire is weak, which means you got yang deficiency. You have yang, you have the heat, but the heat is weak. In the meantime, you put ice water in the pot. What the ice water refers to, you put the ice water there. The ice water is the pathogens of coldness. So the coldness is an yin pathogen. It can damage the yang. So the ice water is the yin pathogen, the coldness. If you put a lot of ice water here, you also don't have steam. So if you were attacked by the pathogen of coldness, you also don't have sweat. That's because of the function or the characteristics of coldness. You can go back to the previous slides, the previous videos, when we discussed the pathogens from the etiology. What's the characteristics of coldness? The coldness can construct. So that will be a cause. You have no sweat. So these are some of the mechanisms of perspiration we're going to discuss further later. And from here, that's why you see when we ask about the symptoms, we ask about different symptoms, the chills feeling or the fever. Now we ask about perspiration. Later we ask about sleeping. You see all these different symptoms. We actually do not ask about the symptoms only. We want to see the body conditions from these symptoms, because from the disorder of perspiration, we can understand the disorder of yang qi and yin fluid in the body. That's why we will ask these kinds of questions. And also from these symptoms and these manifestations, we want to understand what kinds of pathogens, such as the wind or the coldness or the heat, because from our study or our discussion on the etiologies, you will see all the pathogens that we mentioned in our etiologies. It's the wind, the coldness, the heat, the fire, the summer heat, all these stuff. And the balance of yin and yang, we think that's healthy. All this stuff is not something you can test in the lab. If you ask, can show me the pathogen of coldness, if you say that's the lack of perspiration or anhydrosis, it's because of the pathogen of coldness. can show me the coldness. We cannot show you the coldness, but how can we know the coldness? It's from the symptoms. The patient suffers from anhydrosis, and also in the meantime, the patient have other symptoms that can reflect the coldness, the pathogen. Which symptoms we can think about is the pathogen is coldness, or which symptoms can help us to identify the coldness from the information we have introduced from the chills and fever. If the patient suffers from aversion to cold or aversion to cold only, these kinds of symptoms with anhydrosis, inability to sweat, so there's no sweat. The combination of these two, then you can conclude into the pathogen of coldness. The patient might suffer from coldness. So the more we study the symptoms, the inquiries, you need to get connections to the previous inquiries, and also the other diagnostic methods that we are going to introduce. Is actually we try to use different methods, different diagnostic techniques to confirm your diagnosis. For instance, if from the inquiry of fever and chills, I think that I have a general idea that the patient suffers from the coldness. But now, when I ask about the perspiration, the patient says, I sweat a lot. And then later on, when we study the tongue diagnosis, I see the tongue is red with a yellow coating. And in future, when we study, if you understand that the red tongue with the yellow coating indicate the heat. So if we find different conflict symptoms from different diagnostic methods, then you need to think about which one is true, which one is false, which one is the dominant cause, which one is not that important. On the other hand, if a patient, when we found asking of the coldness and fever, the patient said aversion to cold. So I think that the patient may suffer from coldness, the pathogen. And then when I asked about the perspiration, the patient also said that they didn't sweat. So there's no sweating. So in this situation, you will see these two symptoms are matching each other. Aversion to cold made from the coldness, the pathogen, and then no sweat, also a symptom of coldness. So if a patient presents these two symptoms together, then you can confirm your diagnosis. And then when you use the other methods or from the other questions that we are going to study in the later videos, you will see the more you can confirm your diagnosis, the more accurate your diagnosis is. So you are more close to the truth. That's why we need to study all different inquiries, all different diagnostic methods. And from the diagnostic methods, we need to understand, we need to focus on the pathogenesis behind the symptoms and manifestations. From the perspiration, physical exertion, or you exercise, or eating spicy food, you drink hot water, or in hot weather, wearing a lot of clothes, the emotional fluctuation may cause sweating. This sweating is normal or is physically. The abnormal of perspiration or pathologically, there's only two kinds of symptoms. One is inability to sweat, or we call anhydrosis. The other one is abnormal increased sweating, hyperhidrosis, or profuse sweating in defined parts. So that's one is no sweat, one is excess sweat. And from the sweating, we actually can understand the healthy qi, or the healthy qi and the pathogens. Actually, not only about the healthy qi, pathogens, the pathogenic factors, also the influence in the body. Okay, but actually the healthy qi already includes the yang qi and influence in the body. You feel confused here because the influence, the normal influence is the yin qi and yang qi. So normally we also will have sweat. Although you don't feel the sweat can help us to adjust our body temperature. And the questions that relate regarding perspiration should include the absence, presence, or the time when do they sweat, the volume, how severe the sweating, and the location, where do they sweat, as well as other symptoms. The first situation we are going to study is the absence or presence of perspiration, especially in arterial syndromes. When we use the term arterial syndrome, some translation they translate as arterial pattern, superficial pattern, or superficial syndrome. These four different terms means exactly the same, just different translation. So for the arterial syndrome, we can see the nature of the pathogen and the yang qi in the body, the condition of the yang qi in the body. The first perspiration in an anterior syndrome. This is most commonly seen in wind-related arterial syndromes or wind heat arterial syndromes due to external congestion of the wind alone or with wind heat. So from the description here, we need to think about what's the characteristics of wind, or what's the characteristics of heat. So the characteristic of wind have the characteristic of dispersing. That's why the wind can disperse the body fluid through superficial, thus as the manifestation of perspiration. The wind heat. The heat is a yang pathogen. So when the yang qi steams the yin fluid, we cause perspiration. And now in this situation, if the patient suffers from wind heat, there's excess heat or excess yang, although this yang is a kind of pathogen, they also yang. So in this situation, the patient got excess yang qi, steams the yin fluid. That's why the patient got excess sweating. In this situation, it's very similar to the plots in the previous slides. that you add extra fire at the bottom. So you can see you got more steam on top. So that's the perspiration in arterial syndrome. And also, if you want to confirm that's the wind or the wind hit the pattern, how can you confirm that the patient suffers from the wind-related pathogen or wind hit pathogen? How can you confirm from the knowledge that we have studied? How can you confirm this pathogen? So from here, you can think about the chills and fever, the relationship there. We have discussed that if the patient aversion to wind or the patient feel aversion, the patient have fever with mild aversion to cold. So this can indicate the patient suffer from the wind or wind heat, especially in the arterial syndrome. So that's how to use the knowledge previously to understand, to confirm your diagnosis. The second is anhydrosis in an anterior syndrome. So this situation is no sweat. This is commonly seen in wind-cold arterial syndrome due to external congestion of the wind-cold. So this patient suffer from the wind and coldness. The cold can contract the superficial skin. That's how they close the pores on our superficial skin. That cause no sweat. So if patients suffer from the exogenous pathogens, it may cause anterior syndromes. From the anterior syndrome, if the patient have sweat, or if the patient have no sweat, we need to think about this. What kinds of pathogen? If the patient have no sweat, we can think about that the patient may suffer from coldness. If the patient have sweat, we can think about that the patient may suffer from wind or wind heat. So that's the reason why we need to ask about the perspiration. Also, the perspiration can happen in an interior syndrome. This is due to excess yang heat, internal heat due to yin deficiency, depletion of yang or yin. In an interior syndrome, the patient will have internal heat. So in this situation, the patient don't feel aversion to cold. Mostly what happens there is the fire at the bottom of your pot, but you got too much fire there. That's why you got too much steam on top, which is the perspiration. So that's the excess yang heat. Internal heat due to yin deficiency. In this situation, you got internal heat, you got deficiency heat. Although it's deficient, it is deficiency heat, but it also a kind of yang qi, the heat. So you also will have increased perspiration. But when we study in the later slides, you will see this deficient heat, the perspiration due to excess yang heat and perspiration due to yin deficiency. The heat from yin deficiency actually has different symptoms. Also, depression of yin and yang. All these kinds of sweating are with different symptoms. So from here, we just want to let you know that perspiration can happen in an ectasis syndromes. It also can happen in an interior syndrome. The next one is anhydrosis in an anterior syndrome. This is the most commonly happen in a chronic deficiency syndrome. So for this situation, the patient suffers from yin deficiency or yang deficiency. That's why they said contributing factors include yang qi falling to steam and transform in fluids, which means you got very weak yang qi. From the pot in previous slides, you don't have enough heat at the bottom. That's why you can't steam the fluids into the steam, or an insufficient generation of fluid and blood. So that's the two reasons of no sweat. One, you don't have enough yang qi. The second, you don't have enough, you have insufficiency of fluid and blood, that's body fluid. So these two are the common symptoms in interior situation. The perspiration and especially hyperhidrosis and anhydrosis can happen in an exterior and interior syndromes. When you want to confirm with this, you need to ask other symptoms. Especially for no sweat, normally the patient won't come to you with no sweat. The patient will never know. Most of the situation, the patient will never know there's no sweat. So the patient won't come to you and says, "Hi doctor, I have no sweat, can you help me?" So that's not the common situation. In a consultation related to exogenous pathogens, we need to ask about the perspiration situation of the patient. So that's from these two, with sweating or not sweating. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about the abnormal perspiration. The first one, spontaneous sweating. This refers to persistent spontaneous day sweat that aggravates upon physical exertion and is not related to external environmental factors. Contributing factors, qi deficiency syndrome and yang deficiency syndrome. So this kind of sweat, it happens during the day, especially when they're awake. So during the days when they sleep, if someone they sleep during the day, it doesn't count as spontaneous sweating. So the spontaneous sweating refers to the persistent sweat while the patient awake. This kind of sweat will aggravate upon physical exertion. So physical activities will make the sweating worse. Mostly how they will describe that not within a normal exercise or normal physical activities, such as they just walk around, they will sweat a lot. From these symptoms, we can conclude that the patient suffers from qi deficiency. That's from fatigue. Or yang deficiency. Yang also refers to yang qi. So these two are quite similar. Only we want to emphasize different aspects. One, we want to emphasize qi. One, we want to emphasize yang qi, which means the patient will have internal coldness. So these two are similar. In this situation, why the patient have spontaneous sweating? That's because the qi deficiency, the qi loses the function of confining body fluid. That's why the patient have spontaneous sweating. Night sweat. Night sweats are episodes of sweating during sleep. They stop after waking up and are not related to external environmental factors. So these two types of sweating are not related to external environmental factors, which means spontaneous sweating and night sweat, they can happen in a cold day or even in a cold weather. They also can sweat. Contributing factors: internal heat due to indeficiency. So this is our second time to mention internal heat due to indeficiency. Internal heat due to indeficiency is a kind of deficiency heat. The deficiency heat is different from the excess heat, and night sweat is one of the most typical symptoms from internal heat due to indeficiency. The reason why the patient will have night sweat, that's from the theories that during the day, the yang qi travels around your superficial to help you to protect yourself. We call the defensive qi. And during the night, the yang qi travels internally. And when it travels internally, they lose the control of superficial, and also it increases the yang qi in the internally. We call the excess sweat. So this is the night sweat. The night sweat, actually, it is the translation problem. In Mandarin, we don't really call it night sweat. We call it the direct translation is theft sweat or thief sweat. But this doesn't make any sense to you. But why we use the thief? That's because thieves, it means that someone steals something from others. When they call thieves, which means when they steal something from you, you don't know, you don't realize. Because of this kind of sweat, it's actually, we describe it as the sweating during the sleep, not only at night. If someone sleep during the day, if they sweat during the day while they sleep, we also call night sweat. So from the night sweat, don't confuse only at night. That's because of the translation. So the definition, you need to be careful. You need to be careful about the definition. If in the test I asked you true or false, that's in the statements of night sweats are the episodes of sweating during the night and stop during the day. So if you see this statement, it's wrong because of the night sweat refers to sweating during sleep. These kinds of sleeping, not only at night, it also can be during the day. So from here, spontaneous sweating and night sweat in your inquiries, do not ask the patient, do you have spontaneous sweat or do you suffer from night sweat? So these are the medical terms we said in the general introduction of inquiry. Try to avoid these kinds of terms, because even you need to study to understand these terms. The patient may not be able to understand what does it mean by spontaneous sweating, or what does it mean, especially for night sweat. Spontaneous sweating is because of the translation. It becomes more obvious from the name directly, but from the night sweat, it is very easy for the patients to misunderstand as the sweat at night. If you sweat at night, for instance, if you sleep at 11 or 12 o'clock, if you sweat in the late evening, but you're still awake, this is also called spontaneous sweat. So the definition spontaneous, why we put these two, we want to emphasize that the spontaneous sweat is the sweating while you are awake. Night sweat is the sweating while you are sleeping. So in this video, we introduce these are few types of disorder of perspiration. In the next video, we are going to continue the discussion on the other types of disorders of perspiration. Thank you, guys.